Because understanding great literature is better than trying to read and understand yet another business book. On the Leadership Lessons from the Great Books podcast, we commit to reading, dissecting, and analyzing the great books of the Western canon. You know, those books, from Jane Austen to Shakespeare, and everything else in between, that you might have fallen asleep trying to read in high school. We do this for our listeners, the owner, the entrepreneur, the manager, or the civic leader who doesn't have the time to read, dissect, analyze, and leverage insights from literature to execute leadership best practices in the confusing and chaotic postmodern world we all now inhabit. Welcome to the rescuing of Western civilization at the intersection of literature and leadership. Welcome to the Leadership Lessons from the Great Books podcast.
Poems of Alfred Lord Tennyson in 3, 2, 1. Hello, my name is Hassan Sorrells, and this is the Leadership Lessons from the Great Books podcast, episode number 130. In the long course of human history, there are people who make an outsized impact in certain areas, including the arts, the sciences, politics, and yes, even finance. Most of these people's names have been long forgotten, but their words and their actions still have an outsized impact on the world. One of the larger challenges of our era of instant communication and everyone knowing everything about everybody all at once is that the number of people who seek to make an outsized impact in all areas they touch has increased, yet there are still people who are, well, average. Serving where you are at the highest possible level of your talents and skills without looking for claps or approval is actually the gold standard of behavior in our time. We make the default setting for leaders the idea that every leader should be competent at every aspect of leadership. But this is just as faulty an assumption for leaders as it is for followers. Sometimes some leaders need to just be competent at one thing. One thing. And if they are competent at that one thing, they can have an outsized impact on the world long after they are gone. On the show today, we will extract lessons for leaders from the most unlikely source possible. And while I am not a poetry guy, quote unquote, I personally think the poetry needs to rhyme, and that Ogden Nash is probably the height of poetical doggerel. And by the way, we're going to be covering Ogden Nash next year on the podcast, so stay tuned for that. These poems that we are going to read today have lines and have ideas and have thoughts that have entered the lexicon of Western thought. This goes beyond zeitgeist and have generated an outsized impact. Today, we will read and discuss the poems of Alfred Lord Tennyson with our returning guest co-hosts today, Ryan J. Stout and Dr. Moumin Quazi. Leaders, serve where you are planted at the highest possible level of your talents and skills without seeking claps or approval. So today we're going to pick up in our book reading with the Oxford paperbacks version of Tennyson's poems and plays. So this is a collected edition, right? It has a lot of different poems and plays in it, edited by T. Herbert Warren and revised and enlarged by Frederick Page. There's a lot of content in this book. We cannot possibly cover it all. It would be impossible. Thus, we are not going to. Instead, what we're going to do is we're going to read, we're going to examine certain select poems, some of which you will know, and a couple of which you won't. And then we're going to frame those in terms of leadership, in terms of how people lead and what leaders can learn from poetry. Now, one of the struggles that we have in our world, and I was actually just listening to a podcast about this over the course of the weekend, is that poetry is fundamentally an Eastern medium, right? The way in which we think is different with poetry, or has to be different with poetry. Poetry is about a journey towards something, whereas a narrative and we live in a Greek-oriented rationalist, scientific rationalist sort of environment, even with our religion and our fantasies. We still want things to make sense. We want narratives to make sense. That's a very Greek way of looking at the world. And we need both ways of looking at the world. We need both of those ways merging together. And so when we look at the poems of Tennyson, one of the things that will strike us immediately as we read them is, well, is what he is doing in taking folks along, taking the Western mind along a journey. And I quote or I read from Ulysses. This is the first poem that we will look at today. It's a longish one, so bear with me. I'm also going to give you a little bit of background on the poem, and then we'll let Moumin and Ryan jump in with their thoughts on the poem. And by the way, thanks to Ryan for suggesting these poems as ones that we should look at today out of Tennyson's broad oeuvre or oeuvre. I have no idea how to pronounce that. Moumin will correct me. I'm not even worried about it. He'll correct me on this. All right. And I pick up from Ulysses. A little prophet said an idle king by this still hearth among these barren crags, mashed with an aged wife, I meet and dole unequal laws into a savage race that hoard and sleep and feed and know not me. I cannot rest from travel. I will drink life to the lees. All times I have enjoyed greatly, have suffered greatly, both with those that love me and alone. On shore and wind throw scuttling drifts, the rainy Hyades vex the dim sea. I am become a name, for always roaming with a hungry heart. Much have I seen and known cities of men, and manners, climates, councils, governments, myself not least, but honored of them all, and drunk delight of battle with my peers, far on the ringing plains of windy Troy. I am a part of all that I have met, yet all experience is an arch where the throw gleams that untraveled world, whose margin fades. Forever and forever when I move, how dull it is to pause, to make an end, to rust unburnished, not to shine in use. As though to breathe were life, life piled on life were all too little, and of one to me. Little remains, but every hour is saved from that eternal silence, something more, bringer of new things, and vile it were for some 3 sons to store and hoard myself, and this gray spirit yearning and desire to follow knowledge like a sinking star beyond the utmost bound of human thought. This is my son, mine own Telemachus, to whom I leave the scepter and the isle, well loved of me, discerning to fulfill this labor by slow prudence, to make mild a rugged people, and through soft degrees subdue them to the useful and the good. Most blameless is he, central in the sphere of common duties, decent not to fail in offices of tenderness and pay. Meet adoration to my household gods. When I am gone, he works his work, I mine. There lies the port, the vessel puffs her sail. There gloom the dark broad seas. My mariners' souls have toiled and wrought and thought with me, that ever with a frolic welcome took the thunder and the sunshine and opposed free hearts, free foreheads. You and I are old. Old age hath yet his honor and his toil. Death closes all. But something ere the end, some work of the noble note may yet be done, not unbecoming men that strove with gods. The lights begin to twinkle from the rocks. The long day wanes. The slow motion climbs. The deep moans round with many voices. Come by, my friends. 'Tis not too late to seek a newer world. Push off, and sitting well in order, smite the sounding furor from my purpose holds. To sail beyond the sunset and the baths of all the western stars until I die. It may be that the gulfs will wash us down. It may be well that we shall touch the happy isles and see the great Achilles whom we knew, though much is taken and much abides, and though we are not now that strength which in old days moved. Ulysses was written in 1833 and revised for publication in 1833 and revised for publication in 1842. And by the way, this is according to the Tennyson library pieces that are online. I'm quoting this directly from them. Tennyson reworks the figure of Ulysses by drawing on the ancient hero of Homer's Odyssey and the medieval hero of Dante's Inferno. Homer's Ulysses is described in scroll 11 of the Odyssey, One is from a prophecy that he will take a final sea voyage after killing the suitors of his wife Penelope. The details of this sea voyage are described by Dante in Canto 26 of the Inferno. Ulysses finds himself restless in Ithaca. By the way, Ithaca, pause. That is a city in New York that I once lived in and worked in, and driven by the longing that I have gained to experience the world. Dante's Ulysses is a tragic figure who dies while sailing too far in an insatiable thirst for knowledge. Tennyson combines these two accounts by having Ulysses make his speech shortly after returning to Ithaca and resuming his administrative responsibilities, and shortly before embarking on his final voyage. Okay, so we opened up with that. I've talked quite a bit. That's a long poem. Let's get Moumin and Ryan in here. We're going to kind of flow a little bit with this today. Thoughts on Tennyson, thoughts on the opening poem Ulysses, and the little bit of thoughts on the literary life of Alfred Lord Tennyson. Moumin, why don't you go ahead and get us kicked off here?
Love to. Thanks for inviting me to be part of this podcast today. I really enjoy it and appreciate you. And it's great to meet Ryan as well. I love the poem Ulysses. I believe my mentor when I was at University of North Texas, he called this arguably the greatest poem in the world, or the greatest poem ever written. He's a Victorianist, so he is biased, but I think that it is one of the greatest poems ever written. It really does capture the spirit of the Victorian age, especially. He Tennyson does some interesting things with the original story and alters it for his purposes. One of those being that in the original um, Homer poem, all of his mariners have passed away or died on the way to Ithaca there in Greece. And so for him to say, you know, hey, my fellow mariners, let's go back out after just 3 days of being home, that's an alteration. Um, but still, the fact is he has captured the spirit of 19th century, empire right there by saying, I'm not done. I want to get back out, and I've got to strive to seek, to find, and not yield. I'm still alive, basically. So I have three or four kind of big points, and one of them being that the poem was written during a time of intense grieving. He lost his friend. We'll talk about it in memoriam. Arthur Henry Hallam, a shining light he thought had so much potential. It was one of his best friends, and he lost him. And it was a shock to everyone's system. And for Tennyson, he really found himself in a period of grief and mourning. He writes Ulysses finally in the kind of getting himself out of the grief funk that he's in. But he's not really publishing for a long time. But he's writing these poems in memoriam, and Ulysses is one of those poems. So I would suggest grieving isn't the end. If you look at this poem, you can see that grieving and expressing that grief in a very artistic way is really the beginning. Two, it reveals the longing for connection. He mentions Achilles. He mentions, of course, Ulysses is speaking, um, but he's saying, I might, meet back up with Achilles. And so you could see a man longing to reunite with his best friend. Three, it illustrates the aspirations of Tennyson's national spirit to follow knowledge like a sinking star beyond the utmost bound of human thought. This is a big deal. This is the spirit of the age. And then I would suggest that um, he recognizes that there are different roles that serve vital purposes. Telemachus has his emerging role as the new leader. He's, in his early 20s now. He's been without a father figure for 20 years. He's been having to kind of fend off suitors who have come after Penelope and trying to usurp Odysseus or Ulysses. And so he doesn't belittle Telemachus's role as the leader when he's going to be gone. He says he has his role, I have mine. And so finally, I just want to just reaffirm that notion that Ulysses is also saying, I'm not dead yet. Like from Monty Python and the Holy Grail, I feel happy, I'm not dead yet. Don't put me on the cart. I don't want to go on the cart. Ulysses here is saying that I'm not dead yet. I have more to do. I'm gonna, again, those awesome verbs, to strive, to seek, to find, and not to yield.
Excellent. Thanks. Thanks, Moment. I took a bunch of different notes there.
Yeah.
I want to ask some follow-up questions around that. But first, Ryan, what did you think of this poem? What struck you about this?
Well, Mona, thank you, and hey, San, as always, it's a joy to be here, and echoing a lot of the sentiments, but also the thing that I think struck me, there is an acceptance here, and the theme of fate that emerges, or he even mentions, Ulysses mentions, and just the acceptance of that. Almost, if I don't, there's the first paragraph of Cat's Cradle, the Vonnegut book. It's even if I was born, I forget the name, but even if I was born a Thomas, I would have been a Brian.
Mhm.
So it's like you can't run from who you are. And I think there's an acknowledgement of that, as he sort of pines about getting getting into trouble. It's also to mention another contemporary movie. It's Oliver Stone talks about that in Natural Born Killers. He's doing the interview and they're in the prison, and Robert Downey Jr. asks him the question. He says, "Man, I'm just a natural born killer." So there's like an acknowledgement and acceptance of this thing that's it's an outlier of a personality. That's one. And the idea of not being able to rest, I don't know, the thirst for knowledge. I don't, is there an acknowledgement of that's the thing that is also like leading him to his death, or that's what I don't think it's leading to his death. It's that's how he wants to go. Um, it seems like he's lived a pretty exciting life. And so even after all is said and done, this is how I would like to spend my time, my last days, sort of thing, even acknowledging, passing on to Telemachus and so forth. And I think, what else do I have here? Tennyson does this so beautifully, but also as Ulysses in the poem, despite all of uh, his motivations and he still has time to acknowledge the beauty of the natural world and the language that he uses to describe that. Where is
Well, he talks about the sunset.
yes, yeah. There was one particular line though, but yeah, that's so. There's still an acknowledgement of the beauty of the natural world, and I think someone who's sailing off into the great unknown. What a wonderful thing! It's like living. It's kind of distilled into living in the moment, and wouldn't we all really like to do that?
Well, we've got a little bit of a thing here with Ulysses, and I'm a person who I'm not obsessed with the Odyssey, but I've read it a lot. And Odysseus.
I am.
You're obsessed. Okay, Mo.
Yeah, I teach it every semester.
Yeah, he has to be obsessed. And how Homer had tied the Iliad and the Odyssey together, and then how they really need to be read and studied together. I'm fascinated by all of that. As a leadership idea, though, there's a couple of different leadership ideas that I think are in this poem, that I would like to get your thoughts on. A moment you hit on one, this idea of passing along your legacy to others,
Mhm.
but also acknowledging that you're not done. And we have this in our society and culture right now where, quite frankly, people in the baby boomer generation have struggled to let go. We can see this most notably in politics, but there's other areas, entertainment, culture, corporate business, where you just have a generation that has had an outsized influence on American culture in the latter half, or had an outsized influence on American culture in the latter half of the 20th century, who just will not let go. And I'm in my mid 40s, and being a person in my mid 40s, the I won't say the ship has almost passed, but I can see the ship like sliding away as people just won't let go, you know. And so and then there's generations behind me who are much younger who are screaming at the boomers to let go.
Yeah.
And so we have this tension and struggle in our culture. So that's at one level, at a leadership level, which, by the way, and you see this sort of reflected in the poem. Um, one of the challenges of not letting go is you don't create a succession plan. You
Mm.
have no plan for letting go. You have no plan for release, right? And I liked how you talked about how Tennyson's poem here reflects the spirit of the Victorian age. The Victorian age had zero interest in letting go of anything. First, we just covered All Quiet on the Western Front on this podcast a couple episodes ago. And so, the first big trauma that had to happen to the Victorian age was World War One. But the stuffing didn't all get knocked out of them until around World War II and the collapse of the British Empire, right? And I would assert that was because the Victorian age did not want to let go. It did not want to surrender to the next zeitgeist, the next historical cycle that was coming into being. And so, and part of the reason why it didn't want to surrender was that succession. It could not see who was going to pick up the baton and move the thing forward. I think it's very important for leaders to have a succession plan. Thoughts on this idea of succession plans and sort of how you do this as a leader, leveraging some of the ideas in this poem?
You want me to jump in there?
Yeah, go ahead.
So in the Odyssey, of course, Homer's epic poem, Telemachus it's an interesting poem. It starts off by talking about sing to me, O muse, of the man of complicated who's complicated, the man of twists and turns, the complicated man, and it's Odysseus. And
Mm-hmm.
and you think, oh, this is going to be a story about Odysseus. And then the
Mm-mm.
next chapter goes right into Telemachus.
Right.
And the next chapter is about Telemachus. I mean, in other words, we don't really get to Odysseus way into the poem, and then we find him on a shore crying to go home, wanting to go home. He's on the island with Calypso. But Telemachus is the one who the focus is on, and the focus is on Telemachus as a man, as a young man who he's finally kind of bridged that gap from adolescent and young adulthood into now what's he gonna do? And he's downhearted, he's downtrodden, and I think that a lot of the poem um is concerned with who is Telemachus? What is his true temperament? Is he a man, or is he less than masculine and less than able to take the lead? And it's one of those things where we see that he has a wonderful side to him that's very compassionate. He practices this code that Zeus has instituted called the Code of Xenia,
Mm-hmm.
the code of hospitality. He sees a person who's walked into this palace after, several years of suitors abusing their hospitality. He sees a man there who has not been attended to, and he walks to him and says, who are you? Not who are you, but welcome. Let us take care of you. Become refreshed. Let's feed you. And that man happens to be a gentleman named Mentes, but it's actually Athena in disguise.
Right.
And she realizes in the form of Mentes that Telemachus is discouraged, at wondering if his father is alive or not. And from that point on, we see a really wonderful person in Telemachus who's about taking care, not of just his mother, but also in the absence of his father, taking care of the palace, taking care of the kingdom. When Odysseus finally does return to the land of his home, and he finally gets to meet back up with Telemachus, he tests him immediately about, are you a kind of a um, less than male? Are you less than masculine? Did you allow this to happen at the palace? What
Right.
did you do? Who are you?
Yeah.
And
Are you worthy?
are you worthy? Are you, or, to use Dana Carvey's, kind of, imitation of Arnold Schwarzenegger, are you a girly man? And he's really trying to get like, who are you, Telemachus? So I'm just saying, he's trying to figure it out. He does realize, though, oh, Telemachus is somebody who I would be very proud of. And finally, Telemachus gets back with the suitors with Odysseus, his father, with him. They don't know that it's Odysseus, but one of the suitors starts abusing Telemachus in front of everybody. And Telemachus stands up and says, "The boy you once knew is gone. Now I'm a man." And that's something that's really makes Odysseus proud. Now let's go back to Tennyson. He writes, I've been back 3 days, basically after this long 20-year journey, 10 years fighting in Troy and 10 years trying to get home. Now I've been back 3 days and I've got to, in the original, in the poem, he's got to take care of the suitors' relatives who are going to come after him for killing their pappy, right?
Mhm.
And or whoever, and he now knows that he has to take care of, wrap some business up. So he goes to the land of his father, and Athena has to step in and say, it's time to put an end to all this fighting. And she hands down finally the last lines of the Odyssey are, she hands down the pacts of peace, right? But the whole point there is that Odysseus has to take care of this business, but in the meantime, he can leave Telemachus at home and know that everything's in good hands. And I like that Tennyson says, basically, Telemachus is good at this. He's good at managing people. He's good at diplomatically dealing with, and he's with all sorts of, factions, but he's also good at hospitality. And so he realizes that the kingdom is going to be in good hands while he's gone, doing what he does. But there is the sense that he does expect one day to come back home, but he still has there is an element of uncertainty in there, which of course we'll talk about in these other poems that we're going to examine.
Yeah. 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 Um, Go ahead, Ryan.
No, I was going to say, just tackling from the angle of Tennyson and the role in literature, moving from the Victorian period, the Renaissance before that. So you have this burst of creativity. Then you go into the Victorian period where the focus is on reason thinking. And then, and I think for Tennyson, there's just about every poetic device is used in the poem. There's internal rhymes, assonance, dissonance. He's using meter. He's using all of these things in different ways throughout and I think and as contemporary poetry moves forward, because we get to after the Victorian is the modern period, and that's where like form and things start to fall apart. And
Mhm.
so I half wonder if Tennyson is because it is masterful from the first word to the last word. It is masterful.
Mhm.
And I called Hey Simon, thanked him. I was like, dude, I forgot what role this person played for me writing poetry 20 years ago and coming across him, learning about him. But to go back and look at this and to see how even to go through with like a fine-tooth scansion, it's 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 still, there's more and more and more. The more I looked at it, the more there was, and I can almost
Mhm.
go like line for line. And let me get back to it here. Where is it? Um, so the use of uh, consonants here, and manners, climates, councils,
Mhm.
governments. So
Mhm.
you have the repetition of the M, the repetition of the C's, and you have these internal rhymes and these slant rhymes. And as the poem starts, it's way the form, as far as like end rhymes and how he's using punctuation, is way there's a form to it, and as the poem goes on, it kind of unravels,
Mhm.
and that it becomes almost it almost looks like a helix, like a double
Mhm.
helix. If you look at it in like a three-dimensional form, like my brain
Mhm.
kind of does.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
so just the fact that he is honoring the language and clearly has a love of the language and syntax, and so kind of like looking at it from that end to add to the nostalgic end of things of like, these are all of the tools from the beginning that got us here, and this is kind of like, the masterpiece. And so kind of looking at it from that end, it was a really wonderful thing to learn that he worked on these for such a long time.
Mhm.
So this isn't,
Mhm.
that's a misconception of poetry, and I know a lot of poets will do will be kind of sinister in how they speak about their works. Will say, "Oh, that took me to that just flew right out of me," um, and often that is a lie. And this is evidence that like 17 years, at least Mariana, but I know this one was worked on for quite some time as well. So that's kind of just my approach and angle at it. Like, just I love the language, and I love all that aspect, like the nerdy stuff of poetry.
One thing you mentioned though, I think after the Renaissance, which we have the Enlightenment age, we also have the Romantic era, and so you have people like Wordsworth talking about poetry being inspired by it's memory, that inspires the feelings that you had back when you actually experienced the thing. So we had before, in between the Renaissance and the Victorian age, we had a lot going on there, and of course the romantic era is a really important one. But you mentioned nature, which the romantics were very into. In you mentioned the Victorian era being more centered on reason. I think what's going on with this notion of reason is that it's in tension with the the old ways of thinking in terms of religious faith and the certainty that comes from dogma and from various Christian doctrines. And so I know that Tennyson deals with that in Memoriam. We're going to see that kind of tension between faith and certainty and doubt and the new scientific um, discoveries that are happening geologically, archaeologically, and so forth. And so, um, and then Hassan, you mentioned earlier, after the Victorian era, you've got the Edwardian, but then it
Mhm.
goes right into, finally, when we do have the modernists, right, and then into the postmodernists, it's like we're no longer thinking in terms of Victorian anymore. We're thinking more like, whatever, Elizabeth is.
Yeah, yeah. Well,
Yeah.
and that's one of the things that is interesting to me about literature, and as well as film, but let's keep it to literature here for just a second. Um, One of the challenges of a postmodern mindset, a postmodern deconstructionist mindset, and I don't really care what your politics are on this. This is not a political statement. This is a factual statement about what happens in postmodernism and deconstructionism when those two forces are combined together. So postmodernism devolves everything to power. Everything's about power and who has it and who doesn't. But deconstructionism devolves everything down to You could pull everything apart and argue every single side. Sophistry, basically. You can argue every single side of every single argument, and then you argue it into nothing. And one of the things I've asserted on this podcast over the course of the last year, and I'm going to also be asserting it next year, is that, and you mentioned nature and religion, right? You mentioned dogma, right? You mentioned romanticism. One of the things that postmodernism and deconstructionism do is they destroy romantics. They destroy romanticism. Camille Paglia would say this, right? In her examination of culture. But so would Michel Foucault, by the way. He would agree with that. He would agree. We're destroying romanticism, right? We're exposing reality to the harsh light of reason.
Well, to the idealism.
Sure.
It's a critique of the idealism of.
I would even go a step further than that. It's even more than just the critique of the idealism. It's the critique of the emotion behind the idealism. Even.
Sure.
And you can be an idealist and be a rationalist, but it's really hard. It's really difficult because your own idealism gets eaten up by the acidity of rationalism, and which of course then devolves into deconstructionism, and now you're in a hole that you're back in a doom loop, basically, as the kids say these days. One of the things that I think we have to do as leaders is we have to, and I'm going to say something. And Moumin, I know you're a professor in the English department, Tarleton State University. Ryan has a long background in creativity and in writing and in publishing and in poetry. I'm going to say something that I think will probably, if not offend you both, at the very minimum, poke you both. Okay, here we go. Here's my statement. But maybe not. Maybe as I think about it, maybe it won't. I think we have to find a way to build at this point in time in Western culture. No more deconstructing. We're done. Because when you deconstruct, at the end of that road, what do you have? You have Nietzsche's abyss, basically, that stares back through you. That's all you got, right? You don't have anything there. And human beings need to create, and they need the emotion that goes along with creation. This is why our movies suck now. Our movies suck now because they're wandering in a circle. And of course, nobody knows how to write. But those are two separate problems that combine.
ChatGPT is pretty good at writing.
Oh, well, don't get me started on the AI thing. Don't get me started on that. Because see, here's what we'll do. We devolve to our technology, right? We devolve to our technology. We say our technology will allow us to be creative.
Thinking machines.
Right. Except the problem with the technologist is you run into the Ray Bradbury problem or the Isaac Asimov problem, depending upon which way you want to go. Right. And yes, you run into the Aldous Huxley and Brave New World and George Orwellian, surveillance state and giving you all the pleasures that you want and da-da-da-da-da. And the flip side of the postmodern idea of power is just pleasure, right? And hedonism. But those are two twin tracks that don't lead anywhere but into an abyss. And so how do you build on the other side of an abyss? How do you build on the other side of that? I think that's the challenging question of our time. And I think romanticism, the romanticism of Tennyson, is part of the answer to that question. But I don't know how we recapture that. I have zero idea how we go back and recapture that.
So this is interesting. You brought up early on like a plan B.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So the plan B for industrialization was what? The internet era? Because because they're pushed out, right? Those things are forced out of whatever the movement is, or the zeitgeist, as you said. And well, I keep thinking about the form is commensurate with like the Industrial Revolution. Things are taking form and becoming more sort of homogenized.
Sure. Okay.
And so that kind of like mirrors the poetry. But then after the Industrial Revolution, you got kind of the internet age. And now we're devolved into this formless cloud. And so it kind of makes sense that, if art and culture, how they influence each other, if there's not a ballast, then nothing is like, what is it tethered to?
Well,
what is our predicament tethered to? And is
well,
that
we've decided.
the issue?
I think in the West, we've decided that our predicament is tethered to identity. I think we've decided that. We've decided that identity is the thing. Whether it's a racial identity, class identity, gender identity, it doesn't matter. We've decided that that's the ballast. I love that word, or the anchor. I would use that term, but ballast is probably better. That's the ballast that we're going to hook our ley lines to, right? Because that will be the thing that will never change, will be our identity. Except here's the problem. The technologists are bringing us a transhuman future, or we'll even be able to manipulate that all the way down to the biological level. Forget what you may think about the politics or the biology of transgenderism. That's the beginning of, the fact is, transgenderism is the beginning of the transhuman movement. It's the beginning of the manipulation of identity at a biological level. Whether it's right or wrong is outside the pale of this kind of current conversation we're having. I'm not talking about the right or wrongs of it. I'm merely talking about the fact of its existence in the zeitgeist. Because to your point, there's no ballast. So there has to be something, because you have to be able to my point, I think my assertion is you have to be able to build. We have to build. We can't just keep deconstructing or going down the twin poles of power and pleasure.
Sand is the deconstruction. And if you're building on sand, that's right. A problem.
And by the way, that works for a guy like Foucault or for Derridian thinking. It works for that sort of idea, because that's the logical end of Nietzschean nihilism. That's the logical end. That's where you wind up at. But the thing is, as I said before, it's a cul-de-sac, right? It turns back on you, right? The abyss stares back through you. Moumin, you've been thinking about what I've been saying. I can see your brain working. Go ahead.
Well, I'm just, for one, I think that, like you mentioned, that the transgender kind of, I don't know, maybe dilemma.
I would say moment, right? The moment that we're having.
That's a good, I think that it's not that it's about deconstruction into such a fragmentation that we have basically no center or no foundation. I think, if anything, we're just more aware of science. We're just more aware of the kind of particularizations that science reveals. And so it's not that that there's all of a sudden these new kind of categories, or it's just being able to put some language to scientific facts, right? So when we go all the way back to the Victorian age, when Tennyson writes in his poem Ulysses, he says, "It may be that the gulfs will wash us down. It may be we shall touch the happy isles." He doesn't know, right? There's a sense of uncertainty, and I think that the Victorian age was very much engaged with the implications of science and or scientific thinking and thought. Like, let's bring Charles Darwin into the conversation. He says,
Darwin would like to enter the chat.
Yeah, he's a person of faith who's also observing scientific phenomena, right? And he's putting language to it, and it's creating, with the archaeological and the geological discoveries, a sense of, oh no, maybe what we have, the answers we have offered in the past aren't going to satisfy a lot of what we're now discovering, right? So it's like the Victorian era is really dealing with this struggle between faith and science, right? And this
right. And it's a struggle that has not, I would agree with you. Yes, that's the Victorian era. It hasn't gone away.
That's right. And, but then we have people like Matthew Arnold saying, here it is, these armies, ignorant armies clashing by night, right? And, and he goes, "Ah, love, let us be true to one another. Let us cling on to one another, basically. We can't be certain of everything else, but we can be certain of our maybe our connection with each other. I think with Tennyson, he's doing he's at least tapping into a similar kind of anxiety, and that's all throughout the in memoriam poems. That's all through, Ulysses. Anything that has to do with this struggle between what we know for certain, but also now things that are going to start to, question and interrogate that, and
Right.
make it, to where now it's not about the certainties of the past. Now it's, oh, wait, maybe how do we reconcile these new discoveries or these new ideas? It is an age of rationality in the sense that that they're now they're dealing with new scientific facts. So how do we deal with that in light of our faith, right?
Well, and the question that science can never answer, it can't, because it's not ill-equipped, right, to answer this question, is what does the discovery mean?
Well, it's I'm
So,
sorry to interrupt, but like language is being left out of the equation, and I think it's really important. So,
okay.
for instance, there's a Japanese phrase, koi no yoken.
Mhm.
And what that means is it's that I see someone and I know without a doubt that that is the person I will spend the rest of my life with. There's not a
Right.
word in English for that. So what you guys were just talking about is like it was the melding of these two things that otherwise don't have an identifier to pull them together. So something has to be created. Koi no yoken has to be created because it is the melding of two things, or otherwise unidentifiable as separate. They are not as great as their the
As
total of
there
the parts.
is a total
So
other parts, yeah.
kind of creating and that's kind of where I see it's kind of coming in from
Yeah.
it's not like I don't know, how do you, is it an invented emotion?
Well,
You
I
see
think you
what I'm
got to. I think
saying?
you. Yeah. I think you have
Definitely
to.
not an invented
No,
emotion.
no,
It's
no.
definitely putting language, like you're saying, it's putting language. That's what Tennyson's so good at. He's putting language on the spirit of an age and the anxiety of an age, in a way that no other poet could do it.
And
Um,
with the atomization of our postmodern culture, we have many voices trying to put language on an age and
sure.
on a set of anxieties. And it's the the analogy is the blind Hindus touching the elephant, right? We know this story, right? One touched the trunk and thought it was a rope. One touched the right, and they're not talking to. And the interesting thing about that tale, or that allegory, such as it were, is that none of the blind Hindus talk to each other,
In
which
that
is
story.
in that story, right? Which is to me really interesting, which is why it's used very often or referenced as a way where, or as a uh not a synecdoche. I don't know why I just thought of that word. It's used as a vessel, right,
Yeah.
for understanding atomization, right, and for blindness to the bringing together of things, or the uniting of things. And my only assertion, this is my only assertion, is that we need something in order to build forward, because otherwise, then 2064 is just going to have better technology with the same arguments. We're going to be having the same arguments just with personal robots walking around. If Elon Musk has his way, which, okay, like, like we'll all have personal robot, like we'll have cars, right, or iPhones. And to what end? Why? Why? And that's the question again that science can't answer. Why do I need this? What is the meaning of this thing? Science just says we can do it. To paraphrase from Jeff Goldblum in the great original Jurassic Park,
I watched that today.
you were so worried about whether or not you could, you didn't stop to think about whether or not you should.
Sure.
And now you've packaged it, And he slaps the table. I love that. And now you package it and you put it on lunch boxes and it's on t-shirts. And we laugh at this because it's the combination of consumerism and the sort of postmodern cynicism. We won't be romantic about this, and scientific rationalism. And then the dinosaur eats all the people, which is kind of where we're at right now. And we have to, my concern always for leaders is, how do they take Tennyson's work, which may be romantic and inspiring and stirring? And I agree, Ulysses is an inspiring and stirring poem. I loved reading that out loud. How do we take that at a practical level to our people and say, let's build on this inspiring, stirring thing? Yeah. Let's build on that. Let's move that forward in spite of everything we're seeing in our crises that I think fundamentally go back to meaning. We could talk about that, but our crises that are all around us. Because unlike in the Victorian era was right buttressed up next to faith. As much as they wanted to get away from it, churches were still being filled. Public and private acknowledgement of religion was still going on in the Victorian era. Sure. Darwin only really captured the elites, really, if we're going to be honest about Darwin. Darwin's ideas captured the elites, from Mary Wollstonecraft all the way to Percy Shelley. And that's not very far of a gap, but like, it captured the ideas of it captured the mindset of the elites. But the average person, the common person that was walking around in the West, they were still going to church.
Well, they were going to church, but they were, it's the same kind of argument that people are having today when they go to the Creation Museum down in Glen Rose. It's like, well, did people really, exist when dinosaurs did? It's sort of like you can talk to people who are just as kind of adamant about the creation story, not involving evolution, and then others who've really pushed back against evolution. There's a lot of people who, would just not hear it, especially in this part of the world. And, but I'm going to come back to Tennyson. He says, old age hath yet his honor and his toil, death closes all. Right. So there is the sense that we do know some answers, even in spite of the swirl of the age, which is, like you said, Darwin, with the beagle and all, he even if there's a disconnect in terms of their timelines, maybe in their discussions with each other, there is still in that zeitgeist a sense of what do we do with a past. I mean, the Renaissance, they were still wondering, like, does purgatory exist, or do we need to, rely on our reason? And do we have to have facts and data to support our interpretations versus just going with superstition or with
how we come full circle, huh?
Right. but one thing is true, is certain: death, right? Whether you're a faith-based person or an evolution-based person, you need death, right? Old age hath yet his honor and his toil, he says. Death closes all, but, and there's the big but, the big contrast, something ere the end, some work of noble note may yet be done, not unbecoming men that strove with gods. So, I mean, to me, I think that still can apply now, whether or not you put gods in a metaphorical, light, or as a faith-based, who believes that there may be a creator God or what have you. The idea, some work of noble note may yet be done. That's awesome. Because especially you're young to me. I'm 62, right? I look at it like, do I have 5 years? Do I have 10 years? Do I have 15? If I'm lucky, do I have, we don't even know if tomorrow's guaranteed, right? But I would like to believe that something before my end, some work of noble note may yet be done, including being part of your podcast.
Well, I will say
and
this.
How
go ahead.
Some work of may yet be done. And the scene that he's painting is it mirrors the language. So work may be done, and the lights, the day wanes, And so it's sort of like the ending. They're mirroring each other. The language and the sentiment and the idea are mirroring each other, which is a really wonderful thing.
Well, we've just only been through one poem. we're only like 45 minutes into the show. And we've only been through one poem. And Moumin, I've taken I'm not going to say what town I live in because this podcast goes everywhere, but Moumin knows the town that I live in. Very well. And I could tell you looking around, I am saying to myself internally, I got 30 years of good work probably left in me. Okay. Already at this stage. I'm like, I got 30 years and that's going to go by like that.
Yeah.
You know, and I'll turn around and it'll be gone. And before I moved to this current town that I was in, I'm in, I always thought like, you know, wander around to like age 100 or something like that. But now I'm realizing maybe that might not be the thing.
Yeah.
It's sobering, right? It's not, it doesn't create an existential crisis in me because, to your point, I'm one of those people of faith. So I don't have an existential crisis about that. I have existential crises about other things, not about that.
Well, it is interesting. So the Camus Camus, one of his tenets would be, you know, beyond anything, do not despair. And reading Tennyson, it's like, okay, well, there's the existential, and I know that Camus often gets confused with existentialist and absurdist, blah, blah, blah. But it's Tennyson saying despair away. It's okay. It's okay. You know, it's acknowledging that instead of,
You're right. It's that, like I said, grieving isn't the end, it's the beginning. He is just in the middle of it. He's lost his best friend, and he writes in memoriam, he writes Ulysses. If you read it from that lens of someone who misses his best friend, you can see that this poem really does say despair is okay, right? I mean, it in the sense that it's an honest response to loss, right? And he doesn't know if he will return, if he will reunite with Arthur Henry Hallam. He doesn't know, you know, if Odysseus or Ulysses will reunite with Achilles, the great Achilles whom we knew, right?
Something just clicked over in my head with what Moumin was just saying there with Ryan, with your focus on the language and Camus. And then I'll go into, because we've already talked around Tennyson and through Tennyson, so let's talk a little about Tennyson's background here. We'll sort of switch to this, but this is the thing that clicked over in my head, and maybe this will be valuable for people who are listening.
Hello. So I'm going to do some shilling here, and hopefully this will be a pause in our riveting conversation for you. I have an offer for you. My most recent book is 12 Rules for Leaders, the Foundation of Intentional Leadership. It's available in paperback, hardcover, or as an ebook on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Kobo, and any other place you order books. Now, in this book, I address the 12 leadership areas that I have found leaders need to be the most intentional in to be the type of leader followers actually want to follow. From establishing a foundation of leading teams through managing conflict effectively, all the way through leading teams through change, knowing what to do and why to do it can help readers, like the ones listening to this show, become better leaders. Look, reading this book and living it is like getting coaching from me directly without having to pay my full coaching rate. Head on over to leadershiptoolbox.us, that's leadershiptoolbox.us, and scroll down the homepage and click on the Buy Now button to purchase in hardcover, paperback, and Kindle format on Amazon 12 Rules for Leaders, the Foundation for Intentional Leadership. And that's it for me. Now back to the show.
I think in America, we don't do a good job with number one, we don't do a good job with grief. But number two, we don't do a good job with endings. We just don't. We don't do it at a good job at a private level. We really don't do a good job of it at a public level. So two of the worst disasters probably of the last 20 years have been 9/11 and COVID for the United States of America. I'm not talking globally. I have listeners all over the world. Your mileage will vary. But in my country, in America, 9/11 and COVID. And I think that the cultural breakdowns and challenges that have occurred over the last 25 years around those two twin, such as it were, twin towers of disasters, and I'm not being funny here, the lack of grief, the lack of public grieving, the lack of being able to engage in despair publicly and sort of push all of that out, right, and get rid of it. We don't have any tools in a postmodern context where your two poles are either power or pleasure, because grieving, or the opportunity to grieve, can be seen as a statement of, I'm going to use another P word here that's often used, privilege. Only privileged people can grieve. I got to get up and go to work.
Right.
And when we don't give
how much just that sentiment is postmodernist insanity, because if you look at every single culture forever, grieving was an integral part of their society and how they interface with each other and their strength as a culture.
And we don't.
Yeah, but I would say that postmodernism is not the boogeyman here. There are people, people as in India that I know, because I'm, half Indian, half Pakistani, right? I heard it. We don't have time to grieve. Not grieve. We don't have the energy to be depressed.
The energy.
We're working on just, making a life and having, just getting by. And some, not all my relatives were like that, but definitely there was this sense of, even from my father, who would be like, what's with all this depression? And I think he was in denial, but he'd be like, I don't have time for depression, and that's different from national mourning. I understand.
Right. Yeah.
Look at back. Let's go back to the Victorian era. She is the poster child for national mourning. Everyone knows her, not as the vivacious, kind of German girl who, English girl with the, who spoke German and was a German, had to get that German accent, erased as much as possible. But still, when her beloved husband passed away, she was in black for the rest of her life, with these clothes that went all the way up from her neck down to her, like wrists, and ankles can't be shown for, but it's not just modesty. She was in black, right? And so she was, modeling a sense of, this is what we do, as a nation, when Prince Albert is, dies, right? So Tennyson is in good company, with the notion that you can grieve, you can mourn. People like C.S. Lewis come along later, and he has to resurrect, in a sense, the, like, hey, it's okay. So he writes A Grief Observed, right? He writes these wonderful, observations of just what it is to go through loss, and even as a person of faith, go, it's okay to grieve. It's okay to be depressed, or, we got to work through it, but so I don't think it's a postmodern has somehow made it to where you're making the postmodernism
what I was thinking was, actually, it's like we've made money God, we've made money our God, and so that kind of like breaks everything down.
And my only point is, if you don't offer, with those two twin events, if you don't offer the public an opportunity, even a national day of mourning, right? Like, and by the way, this is irregardless of party. And I know irregardless is not a word. If George W. Bush had declared had declared a national day of mourning, or if Joe Biden had declared a national day of mourning,
Yeah, after COVID. Yeah.
Right.
And
Like,
you're
just
right.
give us a minute.
You're right. The thing is the American response is often let's get even. Let's
Or let's
go.
just push through it. Yeah, let's just
No, I
push
mean,
through it.
let's go to war for 20 years now that, with people who didn't even engage with 9/11, for example, right? We've finally just got out of Afghanistan,
Mhm.
during the Biden administration. So it's like, yeah, there is a sense of, it's almost like you said, it's not about even observing a day of just grievance, not grievance, but grieving
Mhm.
as opposed to the day of grievance.
Grievance, right, right. Which we don't. We already had a summer in 2020. There was a little bit of that. Anyway, moving on.
Yeah.
um, let's talk a little bit about Tennyson because we've talked around and through and over and above this man. So when we look at the literary life of Alfred Lord Tennyson, he was a baron. His name was actually Alfred Tennyson, born August 6th, 1809, and died in the 6th of October of 1892. He was a poet laureate during much of Queen Victoria's reign. And in 1829, Tennyson was awarded the Chancellor's Gold Medal at Cambridge for one of his first pieces, Timbuktu, which, by the way, is in the collection of poems that I have here of Tennyson. We will not be reading Timbuktu today, but I would recommend going and taking a look at it just on the strength of Ulysses alone. He published his first solo collection of poems, chiefly lyrical, in 1830. So this guy had a long and storied career in England. Although described by some critics as overly sentimental, interestingly enough, his poems ultimately proved popular and brought Tennyson to the attention of well-known writers of the day, including Samuel Taylor Coleridge. Tennyson's early poetry, with its medievalism and powerful visual imagery, was a major influence on the pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood. This is the part that's interesting to me about Tennyson's writing. And Ryan, I know this probably jumps out to you with the language piece. A number of phrases from Tennyson's work have become commonplace in the English language, including nature, red, tooth and claw, which, by the way, I thought was Kipling until I started doing some research into Tennyson. I thought Kipling had come up with that. Just better to have loved and lost than never to have loved at all. Most people think that's Shakespeare. Theirs is not to reason why, there's but to do and die. Again, many people think that Shakespeare, if they even think of that at all, I don't even know that that's a common phraseology that's used anymore in our time. My strength is as the strength of 10 because my heart is pure, to strive, to seek, to find, and not to yield. Okay. Knowledge comes, but wisdom lingers. I love that one. That should be tattooed on the foreheads of anyone who accesses the internet via their phone. And the old order changeth, yielding place to new. He is the ninth most frequently quoted writer, I did not know this, in the Oxford Dictionary of Quotations. We've kind of talked about the importance of Tennyson and his poem Ulysses on Western literature. Clearly, the man had an outsized impact, as I mentioned in the intro, with his poetry in general on the West. Very briefly, if you were going to sell Tennyson to someone, and I think we've probably done that already, but if you were going to sell Tennyson to somebody, right? Why should I, as a leader who reads hardcore business books, and only cares about the numbers on the spreadsheet and the hardcore psychology of how to lead people, why should I care about Tennyson? Why should I care about his writing? Why should I care
I
about
think you should care
poetry?
about Tennyson
Why should I care?
because consuming. This is great because are either of you familiar with Amon Hillman as a classicist?
No, I am not. Go ahead.
So he makes some really I don't know arguments for how important the Greek language is and kind of like going and his
I missed his name. What did you say?
Ammon Hillman H-A Hillman.
Okay.
And it is interesting. He really advocates for reading like kind of nothing before. It's all classics. It's all Plato,
Mhm.
Aristotle, and it's like the foundation of thought. And in order to kind of understand what's happening, 2,000 years ago, with and more with those writings, is almost imperative to have the foundation on something like this, if that makes any sense.
Mhm.
Um,
Okay. So I should read it because it's good for me, like my vegetables.
well, I think because you were talking about like, yeah, absolutely. Let me
Okay.
go without fiber for 6 weeks and see how you do. Tell
This is
me,
why,
tell me how life is.
this is why we're gonna Ryan consult.
Having build. So in order to build on steady ground, in order to build on solid ground.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Okay.
I would suggest that Tennyson is a remarkably accessible poet.
Hmm.
Like you just mentioned those quotes. Well, I mean, I recognized all those poems. The Charge of the Light Brigade, of course, has relevance because, Russia's already taken over Crimea, but now is going into Ukraine. But that battle, the Charge of the Light Brigade was all about the Crimea at the time,
Hmm.
right? So, but the lines that you mentioned, there's not to make reply, there's not to reason why, there's but to do and die into the valley of death, rode the 600. It's just very inspiring, very accessible language. And when someone reads the poem, when they hear the words in memoriam, for
Hmm.
example, they may think, oh, well, that's Latin, or that's, that's not for me, but then when you read the poems and you see they're very short little, like almost fragments, they're just almost little, not all of them are long, but most of them are very short. You go, oh, look at what he's saying. Uh, he has very uh pedestrian, mundane images that he's using to talk about, what it is that he's feeling. And I would say the same thing with the language that we read, like whether it be in you know Mariana or Mariana. I don't know how but you look back, a lot of, like you said, a lot of people think, oh, this is Shakespearean. It's like, no, no, no.
Hmm.
He's saying it's better to have loved and lost than never to have loved at all. That's
Hmm.
very accessible. So, Ryan's celebrated the language of Tennyson, but I just second that. It's like it's accessible and it's readable. And I think also the Brits were reading it going, oh, he writes an incredible rewriting of the Arthurian legend.
Right.
you know,
Yep.
and and it's also tapping into not just a mythological past, but it's bringing that past into the present and saying
Hmm.
it's still relevant for us, and it's still something that speaks to us now. I would suggest that we could do the same thing that he did then,
Mm,
go back to the old stories, bring them into the new, like Odysseus is now Ulysses, but not just Ulysses, the man who's going to, end up having Athena deliver pacts of peace, but now he's this person who may just go traveling again for a whole bunch of years, leaving his aged wife at home after, being away from her all those years. I'm just saying he takes those things from the past, like Ryan mentioned, 2,000, 3,000 years before, he brings it into the Victorian age. Now, I think that we, just a mere 200 years later, can bring those things from that era into our present age, and they still are relevant, they still matter, and it strikes a note, it strikes a chord. Who doesn't feel sad when someone is lost? Who doesn't feel proud of their nation when it does something right? Who doesn't feel like we want to go back and resurrect the heroes from our in our memory, and bring
Hmm.
them into the present? I think that's what Tennyson does for us.
it's interesting, hey, Son, you were talking about the deconstruction. It's like, moment to your point, it's I think that's the first thing that I was drawn to, is like, oh shoot, we have to read Tennyson. This is going to be a beast. And then I was like, wait a minute,
Yeah.
this is pretty easy. I was like, this
Yeah.
guy is making it, like you're saying, this is for everyone. It's not this thing that's hoarded and I can't do it. I'm brilliant. I'm smarter. It's like, no. I'm going to share all of this with you. Clearly this is a touched person in this area, and why not share that? That kind of builds on the spiritual end of things as well. When you talk about the use of nature in his writing as well. So that's I appreciated that. Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you. And the thing is this poem, these poems, this poetry is, oh, you made me think something, and then it just zipped away. But he's speaking to not just the feelings that we experience, but he's also saying something about poetry. He's saying something about the poet. He's saying that there are things that people who are creative, who are tapping into something else that is maybe supernatural. You might want to say we transcend by getting into this act of creation. He's engaging us in it, and he's inviting us into that space. And when we go there, we're not disappointed. But it's just a lot of times people think, oh, it's not you, but a lot of times people come into it thinking it's going to be beyond me. It's going to be
Yeah.
too erudite. It's going to be too whatever. Now, that doesn't mean that an educated reader can't get a lot more of the references or allusions. I mean, it's going to happen when someone knows the Arthurian legend. They're going to come to, Morte Arthur and go, oh, yeah, I get it. There's a lot more going on here. Or when they read Ennoni, right, they're going to be like, oh, okay, I know about Paris and, the promise of Helen based upon, the judgment that he meted out to, between Hera, Athena, and Aphrodite, right? I mean, when you read those poems then, and the backstories from those classical stories, yeah, it's a lot richer, but that doesn't mean that you have to be all educated to come to those poems and you could still get something tremendous from it. So yeah, it's accessible. And if you just read the words on the page, even like even the last lines of Mariana, she wept, I am a weary, oh God, that I were dead. Who doesn't get that? You know,
Well,
you know.
speaking of Mariana or Mariana, we're going to read that one next. So let's
Oh,
pick up.
cool.
Let's
Okay.
pick up with Mariana by Alfred Lord Tennyson. With blackest moss, the flower plots were thickly crusted, one and all. The rusted nails fell from the knots that held the pair to the gable wall. The broken sheds looked sad and strange. Unlifted was the clinking latch. Weeded and worn the ancient thatch upon the lonely meaded range. She only said, my life is dreary. He cometh not, she said. She said, I am a weary. I would that I were dead. Her tears fell with the dews at even. Tears fell ere the dews were dried. She could not look on the sweet heaven, either at morn or eventide. After the flitting of the bats, when thickest dark did trance the sky, she drew her casement curtain by and glanced athwart the glooming flats. She only said, the night is dreary, he cometh not, she said. She said, I am a weary, I would that I were dead. Upon the middle of the night, waking, she heard the night fowl crow. The cock sung out an hour ere light from the dark fen, the oxen's low. Came to her without hope of change. In sleep she seemed to walk forlorn, till cold winds woke the gray-eyed morn about the lonely moated grange. She only said, the day is dreary, he cometh not, she said. She said, I am a weary, I would that I were dead. About a stone cast from the wall, a sluice with blackened water slept. and o'er it many round and small the clustered marish mosses crept. Hard by a poplar shook all way, all silver green with gnarled bark. For leagues no other tree did mark, the level waste, the rounding gray. She only said, my life is dreary, he cometh not, she said. She said, I am a weary, I would that I were dead. And ever when the moon was low and the shrill winds were up and away, in the white curtain to and fro she saw the gusty shadow sway. But when the moon was very low and wild winds bound within their cell, the shadow of the poplar fell upon her bed across her brow. She only said, the night is dreary, he cometh not, she said. She said, I am a weary, I would that I were dead. All day within the dreary house, the doors upon their hinges creaked. The blue fly sung in the pane, the mouse behind the moldering wainscot shrieked. Or from the crevice peered about, old faces glimmered through the doors. Old footsteps trod the upper floors, old voices called her from without. She only said, my life is dreary, he cometh not, she said. She said, I am a weary, I would that I were dead. The sparrows chirrup on the roof, the snow, the slow clock ticking, and the sound which to the wooing wind aloof, the poplar bay did all confound. Her sense, but most she loathed the hour when the thick moted sunbeam lay athwart the chambers, and the day was sloping towards his western bower. Then she said, I am very dreary. He will not come, she said. She wept, I am a weary, O God, that I were dead. I gotta say, when I first read that for this podcast, the image that came into my head, and because I think in words first and then in images, because my brain is weird. The words then converted to images. I converted those images converted those words into images in my head of the old school animated show on television, Tiny Toons, which almost no one remembers. Back in the day, Steven Spielberg's attempt to do Looney Tunes. I used to watch it in high school when I would come back from school, and then Batman the Animated Series would come on after that. That was your 1-2 punch, and then my grandma would watch Oprah, and then that was it. I was off the TV for the rest of the day. But for that hour, I would have Tiny Toons, and they did a really good job on that show of hearkening back to, and I've talked about Looney Tunes weirdly enough on this podcast before, but hearkening back to what Looney Tunes did in the 1950s and 60s and 70s in incorporating classical elements into the cartoon, classical elements of literature, music, all of that. As a matter of fact, if you go onto my Facebook page currently, you will see the Barber of Seville with Bugs Bunny and Elmer Fudd. Everything I know about classical music, I learned from Looney Tunes. Anyway, so on Tiny Toons, they had an episode where they lampooned Edgar Allan Poe and the Raven. And weirdly enough, that was the imagery that popped into my head when I read this Tennyson poem. Those are the two things that clicked together in the mashup of Hason's fertile brain. This poem also puts me in mind of Galatians 5:9, where it says, a little leaven leaveneth the whole lump. All you need is a little drop of yeast, right? If you know anything about making bread, and then it just expands and grows. And this poem is a little drop, and then it expands and it grows and it grows and it grows. And that is evidenced in the background of this poem. Again, from Spark Notes, going to grab this off the internet. The subject of this poem of Mariana is drawn from a line in Shakespeare's play Measure for Measure, Mariana in the Moated Grange. This line describes a young woman waiting for her lover Angelo, who has abandoned her upon the loss of her dowry. Just as the epigraph from Shakespeare contains no verb, the poem too lacks all action or narrative movement. Instead, the entire poem serves as an extended visual depiction of melancholy isolation.
But it does have a lot of action. So anyway, I'm going to argue with Spark Notes on that one.
Yeah, go ahead, argue with Spark
I
Notes.
read the same thing and I was like, I don't know.
Well, we will go into the AI generated Google Gemini and we will correct Spark Notes.
I just think they were referring that she's kind of just sitting wearily by a window or something. Like that's sort of what. And I love the chorus. There's a chorus.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Yeah. So
refrain. Yeah.
There's a lot of interesting elements in this poem. And so while Ulysses is about adventure, leadership, it's more of a direct hit to what we actually cover on this podcast, picking someone for succession, all of that. Mariana is a little bit more about the zeitgeist of the time. It's a little bit more about some of the things we've already been talking about, existential dread. Really, though, existential dread, remorse, grief, my lover will not come, I wish that I were dead, all these kinds of things, right? And there's no sort of sugarcoating this, to Moumin's point earlier. I wish that I were dead. I'm weary. I got to get out, right? And the zeitgeist of our time is driven by existential dread of the large things. But I think that dread is driven by, or is driven as a distraction for dealing with or acknowledging the small things. And we see this on both the left and the right sides in our political world. One of the things that has really been obsessing me the last 5 or 6 years has been how our social media platforms allow us to take very local existential dread and scale that up to a national level. The example I always use is this: my oldest son lives in New York State. He should never be getting news about anything going on in the town in which I live in North Central Texas, and yet he does. That's insane. Now we can say on a good end that connects us all, right? But there's a downside to this, and the downside to this is I have no control other than a sense of dread or dismay or remorse on whatever may be going on in his town in upstate New York. Just like he has no control, direct ability to impact and influence events in the town that I live in North Central Texas. And yet we can see those things, and thus our dread is triggered, which, by the way, I think is one of the reasons why those platforms exist. They exist to trigger that dread. That's just they like that because it keeps you on the platform more and keeps you clicking, because you're constantly clicking around trying to resolve that dread with more dopaminergic, pushing, right?
Yeah, they've monetized our anxiety.
Bingo. Excellent. Very good. Yeah, exactly. I love that. They've monetized our anxiety. And there's no reason for it. And this poem is an example of localized anxiety remaining local, which is one of the things I think that it should be local. Go ahead, Ryan.
It just also reading it as well. It's like, so writers, again, and if you're a good writer and you're a remembered writer, they're by default of no fault of there are historians as well. So it starts, as time goes on, it also becomes part of history,
right?
And which is why it's important to look at what was going on in Tennyson's life at the time, and not just he just wasn't plucked down this time period, effused all these beautiful things, and then went back to wherever he was. So I don't it when you were talking about social media, and it's just like the author of an Instagram person, like someone has an Instagram page, through no fault of their own, they are naturally a part of history. They're part of they're part of the historical conversation because of what they represent in the movement. And so and largely that's determined on the relevance or popularity or being sort of remembered. Right. It was just an observation.
Yeah. No, I know. I agree. And that's the upside of these platforms that are sold to us, is that it's the unstated upside, right? You'll be a part of history. We will rise above the unwashed masses of the vast expanses of history who never had a voice. We now all have a voice to rise above those unwashed masses of history and to be remembered in the future, except when Instagram shuts down.
Well, if everybody's memorable, is anybody memorable?
Well, and then it all gets memory hold, and you wind up in the Wayback Machine of the internet, and no one looks for you. Which is why when I pass away, I'm asking my family to scrub all evidence of me ever being on the internet. Just scrub it from existence. Even this podcast will go away. So there is an ending, by the way, to this podcast, kids.
I've started that, by the
way. I mean, I kind of like it. I kind of like the idea that I could just disappear from the internet upon death. And I don't want to be resurrected with AI. I don't want thousands of hours of my voice on this podcast. I'm saying this publicly. I do not want thousands of hours of my voice on this podcast being combined with images so that some nephew or niece or fourth generation great grandkid, 150 years from now or 120 years from now can somewhat see I don't want that. I don't want them to see an avatar of me. I want to go away. When I'm done, I want to be forgotten. I want to descend back into the mass of humanity and be gone, because that's okay. It's a bookend. We're supposed to be gone.
Yeah, he says it right there in the poem. Moumin, I have a question for you. Is how, and this is all, how do you think someone like Tennyson would process the oh my God, the indestructibility of the internet? I don't know, like, I don't how do you think minds, and like I said, this is an odd question, but just because of kind of like how we interpret it and how we experience the internet today, if you were to go back and tell that to, or a modern day person, and describe what the internet is, how do you think someone like Tennyson would process? I guess more succinctly would be like, do you think Tennyson would share the same opinion that Hassan has of himself about being wiped?
About being wiped?
Wiped from the internet.
Or white? I didn't hear what you the last one.
Wiped from the internet. So Hassan's claim is basically after he's dead, he wants to be as if he never existed. And someone is a poet like Tennyson, who's nostalgia and this rich language, and how does that, is there a cognitive dissonance in there?
I don't see Tennyson as having the same desire to be erased after he's passed away. I don't think Tennyson is. I mean, he's left behind so many writings and poems and and of course he had a long life of poetry. He was a poet laureate for many years, and but I don't see. I think he would have embraced the internet and just, he would have just like any great poet now, would have, the best would have gotten on there, and all the other would have been just in notebooks or whatever. And you know what I mean? But I think his song, you're selling yourself short. Like you've got this wonderful creative output, and you've got guests that you've invited to be part of it. And if there's some insight to be gleaned or gained now, well, at least as a historical artifact, it's going to be useful in the future, because it'll hopefully, just like when Ovid says in Metamorphoses, help me, O Muse, to write a continuous poem that's not just relevant for back then, but also for our time, which in his time was the age of Augustus.
Right.
So I'm just saying, now 2,000 years later, we're reading it and going, whoa, these stories are so relevant. So much so that, say, 400 years ago, Shakespeare is using those stories to help him write his plays, right? And then Shakespeare's plays help Tennyson get inspired to write this poem, So how is your podcast going to end up inspiring future leaders to do a similar kind of initiative and teaching tool? And I think it's all wonderful. I'm sad that the library at Alexandria, burned down. Ptolemy's,
Mm.
you know what I mean? It's like, so I like the idea, But going back to Mariana just for a
Mhm.
second,
Yeah.
it's not that you mentioned her localized grief, right? And I
Mhm.
again going back to Ulysses and In Memoriam. Of course, he wrote this in what was it, 1830, right?
Mhm.
And Ulysses is 1833. In Memoriam is between, about those 10, basically 20 years of writing, um, but I think that he again is reasserting that it's okay to grieve
Mhm.
in a sense, he's capturing her grief, right?
Mhm.
Oh, I am weary, I am weary, I am a weary, I would that I were dead, right? But it's okay, and that the poem shows us that grieving itself has a rhythm of its own. um, the mourning of the perceived past certainties, now are replaced with different concerns, with new concerns, right? But one thing that is happening is the world still goes on all around her, right? And that's why I think there is action in this poem. It's not, though, located in what Mariana is doing. It's located in all of the birds chirping and the moss even doing its thing and the
Mhm.
rusting of the nail. Like there's a lot of stuff happening all around her, and we get to see it happen in the cycle of an entire night and day, right? So at the very end, it's not just um it's in the middle of, we see the blackest moss, the broken sheds looked sad and strange, right? Weeded and worn the ancient thatch upon the lowly moated grange, right? It's like all this stuff is happening. Then it happens at the dews at even, right? The dews were before the dews were dried. She couldn't even look on the sweet heaven, either at morn or eventide.
Mhm.
And then we have bats. We have, and then even in the middle of the night, waking, she heard the night fowl crow. Um, the cock sung out an hour ere light. And keeps going down the poem, to where it's not just during the nighttime, but even it says, when the moon was low and the shrill winds were up and away, and on, right? And
Mhm.
finally, near the last part of the poem, it says, the sparrows chirrup on the roof, the slow tick clock ticking, and the sound which to the wooing wind aloof the poplar made did all confound her sense. But most she loathed the hour when the thick-moted sunbeam lay athwart the chamber. So it's not just that she's sad in the nighttime in the middle of the night. She's
Mhm.
also sad and really, really sad. Oh God, that I were dead in the middle of the day, right? When the sun is revealing the dust of her surroundings. I mean, so it's just sort of this again, the rhythm of grief doesn't have a predictability, and at the same time it shows us that sometimes you just have to ride it out, and
Mhm.
hopefully you won't just succumb to the feelings or the thought, I am a weary, oh God, that I were dead. You gotta kind of almost embrace it and then move ahead, right?
And I'm such a reactionary person. To sit in it
Yeah,
is
rough.
it's beautiful, really is.
Uh,
When I think about what I'm doing here, I want to tie these two things together, these two threads together. What we're doing here, right? Um, there's so many books to read, so many insights to be had, right? And I, as I already mentioned, I only have 30 good years of work probably left in me. So
Yeah.
I gotta hustle, right? I gotta get after it, right? I gotta be on it, right? I gotta read 4 books a month. I've got to line up guests. I've got to bring people in, right? I gotta, right?
Yeah.
If I'm and at the end of it, I think a lot of I think of the the pivotal scene at the end of Schindler's List when Liam Neeson as Oscar Schindler takes off his ring, right? His Nazi ring, right? And he says, how many more Jews could this have bought? I didn't do enough, right? I didn't do enough. What this he points to something else. I can't, it's been a long time
Yeah, he
since I've
takes
seen
his
Schindler's
pen,
List. Takes the pin, right? Yeah. Jacket. Yeah. How many more lives could this have bought?
Yeah.
How much more could I have done? Right. And when you look at sort of the commercialized consumerist promises of social media and of the internet, what we're doing here goes in the exact opposite direction of all of that, and thrusts defiantly against all of that. And at a certain point, you just got to be like, I think, well, at least for me anyway, I have to be like, or I have to take the posture of, to paraphrase from Mariana, I am a weary. Not that I wish I were dead. Death will come when it comes. Don't need to wish it or fear or live in fear of it, right? It'll come when it comes, however it comes, whenever it comes. Am I doing enough with the skills and talents and abilities? And my larger concern is that we are so wedded to the short-term games. I just did a shorts episode on this. As leaders, we're so wedded to the short-term click-based games that we know we can win right now, that we don't go on the other side of that arc, right? To do the deep long-term things where we may wind up at the end of 10 years of work or 15 years of work and go, it wasn't enough. I could have done more. It wasn't enough. And so people will often ask me, why are you doing a podcast that you don't sell ads on? And I say the typical answer that I give, and it is a true answer, it's part of the true answer, is that I don't want to have an advertiser tell me what books I can read and what books I can't. I don't want an advertiser to tell me what guests I can have on and what guests I can't. If I'm going to do something outrageous, like I'm going to read Mein Kampf, I'm probably going to want to have an expert on there who may be a little unsavory, who might have some things to say about Mein Kampf. I want the freedom to go get that guy or woman. I do. I want that freedom.
Well, I would hope so.
Right.
I mean, I'm a scholar of Mein Kampf and My New Order. It doesn't mean I'm a Nazi.
Exactly. And I don't need to do a negotiation with a very well-meaning advertiser who has a brand to protect around what you might or might not say, or around who you might or might not be. I don't need to have that. That's a level of complication and ridiculousness in my life that I don't need. So just know.
Well,
just know.
There's also another thing you're talking about. You're talking about willingly putting yourself in a position that would render you powerless.
Sure. Yes,
and
exactly.
I think that's also the powerlessness. It can be applied to this piece as well, because how much we have. We just said how many times Moumin and Hassan. He said we can go at any moment. And we have control over our response or our reaction, that sort of thing.
That's it.
Very outcome.
Stoic.
And so,
well, and then the other reason is, and then Ryan, I'll go back to you for just a second, but I want to close. The other reason I don't have advertisers is because advertisers play a short game. They play a game of short-term content and by the way, that's fine. If that's the game you want to play, I don't object to you. I want to be very clear. Me critiquing you playing that game does not mean I object to the game existing, because if I objected to it existing or not, it wouldn't matter. The game is going to exist anyway. This is how human beings are. It just saying I don't have to play it. If you perceive it as a critique and you're defensive about it, cool. I'm merely saying I don't want to play that, but the game exists. And so advertisers do play that. And I don't want to be part of that game, right? I would rather go in the opposite end and do something different and more interesting that just might not work out. And that's where part of the erasure idea comes from. Because maybe at the end of it, it doesn't work out. Maybe I did all these thousands of hours and the meter didn't even move 5 inches.
It sounds like investment and outcome. Hey, son.
Well, well, and so this is how I think about it, right? And Mariana is the kind of poem that puts that front and center. Ryan, go ahead.
Oh, no, interestingly enough, the ability to stay in the moment, the ability to stay in the moment, while also identifying everything that's in the moment.
Right.
If that,
yeah.
Well, at least the poet's identifying it,
Yeah.
you know, and however she's, in the pocket of this despair, I loved what you said before about just sort of sitting in it, just kind of almost nesting, it's like it's a tough thing not to want to keep fixing yourself, right? Or moving out of that space, right? That you were mentioning, Ryan. But going back to the poem, I love, that Ryan started off the whole analysis back when we were looking at Ulysses with looking at the language. We see a lot of repetition in this poem. Of course, we do see the refrains, but when Tennyson writes, old faces glimmered through the doors, old footsteps trod the upper floors, old voices called her from without. She only said, my life is dreary.
Right.
Cometh not. Right. The fact is though she does have these other people who are still reaching out to her and tapping into her space in a sense by saying, there's still there's still stuff happening, right? And but somehow or another there's got to be something to be said for embracing the grief, but also maintaining your grit. I don't know, in Measure for Measure, if it's that Tennyson takes it to its logic, to what happens with that story, but I think that when Tennyson is writing, he's basically saying you gotta observe the rhythm of this grief, right? You have to embrace it in a sense. It's good if you're surrounded by a support system, right? But also remember, he writes in memoriam after this. He writes Ulysses. He's still writing, but he's in the midst of his grief. It's like when John Milton says, in a kind of an ironic sonnet, that he's like lamenting that his light has been lost. Oh, when I consider how my light is spent, basically he's saying, I've lost my eyesight, but he's like, I'm worthless now. I can't do the rest of my mission in life. But the reality is, he wrote another poem.
He's doing it. He's in the act of
doing
doing
the very thing that he's lamenting that he can't do anymore. And I think it's a similar kind of dynamic we have here too. It's like, we're not done yet.
Well, and creatives, athletes, high functioning entrepreneurs, small business owners, anybody who Ryan made a point about, with the podcast, right? About where my power lies, right? And then powerlessness with an advertiser, right? Well, in the 4 types of folks I've just mentioned, entrepreneurs, small business owners, athletes, and creatives, there is a sense of, and this is why Michael Jordan is still considered to be one of the greatest basketball players of all time, period, full stop. Even when he hasn't played in the league in 25, 30 years almost now, the taste of his name still falls out of people's mouths, right? Why? Because he did everything that he could do at a very high level, and he only left when he couldn't keep doing it at a high level. That's Milton.
Mhm.
He's writing the poem at a high level, even though he thinks he's lost it.
Yeah.
He thinks it's not there anymore.
Yeah.
That's how you know Milton and Jordan and the entrepreneur who you know who's built a business that you've never heard of and yet is everywhere, right? Or the small business owner on your block, right? I've known many small business owners, right, who the reason they can, and this gets back to the idea of succession that we were talking about earlier around Ulysses, the reason they can't give away the business is because they don't think that their son or daughter can do it at the same high level that they did it. They just don't believe it.
There's also an element of like, regardless of what is occurring in your life, like the show must go on, man. And I worked with I worked with a woman. It was unbelievable. She was a dishwasher at a restaurant, a small restaurant. It was the front of it was a meat market. The back was sandwich and bar shop. She had a baby on like a Monday. She was back washing dishes on like Thursday.
Oof.
And we were like, what? And she's like, hey, the show must go on.
Yeah.
You know? And that's it.
That's it. All right. We've been talking about In Memoriam. It is a long poem. There are, my gosh, multiple parts to In Memoriam. Yeah. And then when I first looked at it, I thought, oh my Lord, the Roman numerals never end on the numbering of this one. It gets into the Roman numeral C, which I'm not even clear. I don't even remember what the Roman numeral C is. And I'm sure, yeah, something like it's got to be, right? I thought that was L. Wait, no, L's 50. So C has to be 100. Right. Okay. All right, cool. All I know is there aren't as many Super Bowls as there are parts of the poem In Memoriam. Oh, yeah. Not yet, anyway.
There's a lot of poems, and
yeah, and each one of the poems in Memoriam ties into the next one, with certain elements. But each one of the poems can't stand individually on its own. So we're just going to pull one that has a very famous line at the end, and then I want to wrap up because we've talked extensively today. Both of you have been very gracious with me, and we're rounding the horn here. So I'm going to read In Memoriam. As I sometimes tell my son when I'm reading him, Jules Verne and Journey to the Center of the Earth, my 7-year-old boy, XXVII.
27.
That's right. I envy not in any moods the captive void of noble rage, the linnet born within the cage that never knew the summer woods. I envy not the beast that takes his license in the field of time, unfettered by the sense of crime, to whom a conscience never wakes. Nor what may count itself as blessed, the heart that never plighteth troth, but stagnates in the weeds of sloth, nor any want begotten rest. I hold it true, whatever befall, I feel it when I sorrow most. 'Tis better to have loved and lost than never to have loved at all. And again, there's tons more, right, of these poems. Go out and pick up the collection of Tennyson's poems and plays. It will enrich your life and you will not regret it.
I want to make one comment right here. Reading this, it's so beautiful. Like, it really is. Going back and seeing this and be like, I had this book. What am I doing? But so Picasso went into the cave at Lascaux, the cave paintings, and
yes,
he said, "We've invented nothing." So when I read this or listen to you read this, it makes me it helps me remember that we're standing on the shoulders of yeah, they're almost gods at this point, you know.
Yeah,
well said. Because not only do we quote these people, rightfully, but what they're saying is it feels timeless. It feels prophetic. It feels like more than just a lecture from a professor. It feels like that because they are prophetic. They are prescient. They are brilliant. these poems by Tennyson, and he he says things that get to the real heart of the matter, and again, he is mourning the loss of his best friend who was really young when he died, and he thought there was all this potential, there was all this. He thought that Arthur Henry Hallam was better than Tennyson himself,
Wow.
and so he thought, this is an extinguished light. What in the world is going on with this thing called life, right?
Mm.
And but then he observes the world around him and says, I envy not in any moods the captive void of noble rage, the linnet born within the cage that never knew the summer woods, right? I mean, in other words,
Mhm.
he gives us these images that ultimately he will tell us, um, that it's better to have loved and lost than never to have loved at all. So he goes, it was worth it, right? And
Yeah.
it sounds very romantic, like it's about a man and a woman. I think that's how a lot of pop culture kind of takes it. But this is really, Tennyson the poet is revealing himself as the speaker of this poem, saying, it's better to risk it than to to brick yourself off from the world,
Right. Yep.
Mariana. Right, right.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
it's worth it. And I hold it true, whate'er befall, he says. Right. So
Mhm.
there is truth for Tennyson. He holds some things true, right? He can
Mhm.
still hold on. And that's one of the things that's so comforting in the midst of these poems. He will talk about the this tension between, let's just call it evolution as opposed to
Sure.
science, well, like, and faith, or religion, right?
Mhm.
In memoriam is full of that. There's a
Yeah.
lot of poems that deal with those two, those two issues, and he's trying to reconcile those two things. But here he says, ultimately, I hold it true, whatever befall. I feel it when I sorrow most. It is better to have loved and lost than never to have loved at all.
Reconciliation of tension,
Mm.
access to knowledge, right?
Hmm.
And yet a surefit of wisdom, relationships and the meaning of them and the depth of them,
Hmm.
life and what is this thing? It's almost, the Beatles could have almost written that line. Um, um, institutions, bureaucracies, systemic structures that build cages around people and then demand that we exist inside of them when everything in us is maybe screaming to burst out. Um, I framed my last part of this as the eternal sunshine of the inscrutable mind. I was being clever there.
Yeah.
And I think that our minds are inscrutable to us. We actually don't know ourselves. And a poet like Tennyson opens the door for us to know ourselves by exposing what we don't know in a raw kind of way, but doing it in a way that is gentle, that is fundamentally, I think, loving, right? And loving from a agape sense, not an eros. This is not
Mm.
eros. You may want to put eros to your point. You may want to place eros on top of this, but it is not, that's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about agape love. We're talking about the love between that exists just between people who are pursuing a common goal called trying to figure out life.
Hmm.
Um, and this goes beyond productivity. This goes beyond our tools. This goes beyond our systems and processes. This goes beyond our science and our rationality. This even goes beyond our religious structures and our dogma. This
Hmm.
goes to something else. And poetry is the vehicle for that something else. Um, and so,
It's like,
it,
I'm sorry.
yeah. So, usually I try to wind up these podcast episodes with like, this is what you should maybe take from this. But occasionally I'll run across episodes, or I'll do episodes where the answer will be, I've concluded nothing. I have no conclusions for you. It's an open-ended episode. I'm thinking this is going to be an open-ended episode because I have no conclusion here. There's no denouement from the climax, right?
Well,
but I do believe in what T.E. Lawrence said: never outstay a climax. So we're gonna let Moumin and Ryan close off here.
To come back to your points, though, Socrates was wise in that he said the unexamined life isn't worth living.
Yeah.
Right. And Tennyson repeats that in his own way by saying, I envy not the beast that takes his license in the field of time, unfettered by the sense of crime, to whom a conscience never wakes. Right. I mean, it's embedded. Ultimately, he's saying it's good to think and to have a conscience and to be bothered by the various aspects of life and not just be sort of kind of not slothful, just but not taking advantage of the moments, right? You in Ulysses, he says, "I want to drink life to the lees, right, to the bottom of the cup where the sediment is." Right? I think it's the same thing here. It's like, what does that look like? What does that sense of living life to the lees, drinking it to the bottom of the cup look like? It's not just a hedonistic, it's not just a sense of to eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die. I think but there is a sense of urgency, even if you're going to live into your 80s or 90s or beyond. Who knows what'll happen when we're ultimately at that age? I would hope. It is this sense of, if you're gonna live, you've got to live, and to be in it, like Ryan said earlier, just in it. And so I don't know, these poems inspire me to take the life that we've been given, however that works, and just wring it out to where at the end of it, that cloth is dry. The cup is down to its bottom of the sediment in the bottom of that cup. And it will have been better to have loved and lost than never to have loved at all. I think you could change that out. It'd be better to have lived and lost than never to have lived at all.
Ryan, final words.
That I think Tennyson is both of you beautiful, by the way. Thanks so much. Not only, I think I get a sense of Tennyson's character through reading all of these. And it's not, I mean, I've read this is, and I've never spent this much time on Tennyson, but it has affected me much differently than before. And I don't know, the takeaway is I get a sense that he it's he did the dance. Like he put his money where his mouth is, that sort of thing. Like he didn't just glaze over the summary and then churn all this stuff out with some, there's that book years ago called Million Little Pieces.
Mm-hmm.
And found out after the fact. So, short story, I'm in recovery. I haven't had a drink. The other day was 20 years. And a friend of mine by the name of Cynthia, I've known her my entire life. She bought this book for me, Million Little Pieces. She was like, it was so inspiring, blah, blah, blah. I've read the first 3 pages and I was like, this is BS. This guy didn't do any of this. And then he was on Oprah like a few weeks later.
Yeah.
And and someone who's experienced, who did the deed, I knew that he was lying. But everyone else who read it, they thought it was a miracle. And so that is sort of my takeaway, is like he did all the shit.
Yes.
And so, yeah.
And with that, I would like to thank Ryan Stout and Moumin Quazi for coming on the Leadership Lessons from the Great Books podcast one more time. This is the first time we've had them both on together at the same time. And with that, well, guess what? We're out.
Thank you for listening to the Leadership Lessons from the Great Books podcast today. And now that you've made it this far, you should subscribe to the audio version of this show on all the major podcast players, including Apple iTunes, Spotify, YouTube Music, and everywhere else where podcasts are available. There's also a video version of our podcast on our YouTube channel. Like and subscribe to the video version of this podcast on the Leadership Toolbox channel on YouTube. Just search for Leadership Toolbox and hit the subscribe button there on YouTube. And while you're doing that, leave a 5-star review if you like what we're doing here on Apple, Spotify, and YouTube. Just go below the player and hit 5 stars. We need those reviews to grow, and it's the easiest way to help grow this show. And tell all your friends, of course, in leadership. By the way, if you don't like what we're doing here, well, you can always listen to another leadership show. There are several other good ones out there. At least that's what I've heard. All right. Well, that's it for me.